For 8 seasons, Bewitched turned a witch with a twitching nose and her bewildered mortal husband into one of the most beloved sitcoms television ever produced. It was a show about a suburban marriage disguised as a fantasy comedy, and underneath the spells and sight gags sat a cast of actors whose real lives were often stranger, sadder, and more remarkable than anything their characters ever conjured up. 6 decades on, here's what actually happened to the people behind the magic. Elizabeth Montgomery carried Bewitched as Samantha Stevens, the most powerful witch in the universe who chose to live quietly among mortals. When the show began, she was already the daughter of a major Hollywood name, film actor Robert Montgomery, and she had built her own dramatic television credits long before she ever twitched her nose on camera. That twitch, the single gesture the entire world tried to imitate, was never really a nose twitch at all. It was a small scrunch of her upper lip, combined with careful camera framing, a trick of old-fashioned studio craft that fooled millions of viewers for years. Her personal life moved through 4 marriages. The first, to a young New York socialite, was brief and largely a failed attempt to please a father who was never easy to satisfy. The second was to actor Gig Young, a union shadowed by his drinking and instability. The third, to Bewitched's own producer and director, gave her 3 children whose births were quietly folded into Samantha's own pregnancies on the show, and it lasted roughly a decade before ending in an amicable split. Her fourth and final marriage came to actor Robert Foxworth, a relationship that had already lasted nearly 20 years as a partnership before the two finally made it official. He was by her side until the end. Away from the cameras, Montgomery used her fame for causes that carried real risk for a star of her era. She was an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War. She supported AIDS research and awareness at a time when the disease was heavily stigmatized, and she stood beside gay friends and colleagues publicly when doing so could easily have damaged her career. Colleagues who knew her often described someone almost entirely without the ego her stardom might have justified. Montgomery continued working steadily after Bewitched ended, taking on dramatic television movies that let her stretch far beyond the sitcom housewife audiences associated her with. In her early 60s, she was diagnosed with colon cancer, and she died only weeks later, a shockingly fast decline for a woman who had seemed, to the public, perfectly healthy. The gap between the warm, mischievous, which America thought it knew, and the complicated, generous, occasionally guarded woman she actually was remains one of the more poignant footnotes in television history. Dick York originated the role of Darren Stevens, the flustered advertising executive married to a witch, and he anchored the show through its most iconic early seasons. When Bewitched began, York was already an established working actor with a strong film career behind him, including a notable turn alongside Gary Cooper. It was during the making of that very film that York suffered a catastrophic back injury on set, tearing muscle when he was suddenly forced to bear the full weight of a heavy piece of equipment. That injury quietly defined the next stretch of his life. Doctors prescribed painkillers to manage the damage, and for a while they worked. Then the pain outpaced the medication, and York became dependent on the drugs simply to get through a day of filming physical comedy for a hit network sitcom. The production adapted around him for as long as it could, building special furniture and staging scenes so he could work from a couch or a bed. But the toll kept mounting. By the later years of his run on the show, he was reportedly medicating on set, and audiences at home had absolutely no idea. In his personal life, York had one marriage only, to his childhood sweetheart, whom he met as a young teenager and stayed devoted to for the rest of his life. Together they raised 5 children and later welcomed more than a dozen grandchildren. When York finally collapsed on set partway through the show's run, he never returned to the role, and the production quietly recast his part. What followed was a long and difficult period of financial hardship, but York eventually managed to get sober, an achievement that took a genuine act of will. He went on to found a charity focused on helping homeless Americans, pouring what energy and resources he had left into other people rather than his own comeback. In his final years, he battled emphysema on top of the lasting effects of his old injury, and he needed supplemental oxygen just to get through each day. He died in his early 60s. Millions remember his character as the hapless, lovable Darren, but the man behind the role quietly built something far more meaningful in his last chapter than most television legends ever manage. when Dick York's health forced him off the show. The role of Darren passed to Dick Sargent, an actor who had actually auditioned for the part the first time around and lost it. Years later, under circumstances no performer would wish for, the opportunity came back to him anyway. Sargent stepped into a role the audience had already bonded with someone else in, and the backlash from viewers was immediate. He handled 3 seasons of that resistance with visible professionalism, all while carrying something even heavier in private. For his entire run on Bewitched, and for decades after it ended, Sargent kept his sexuality hidden from the public. Coming out as a working actor in that era would have meant almost certain professional ruin. So he spent enormous personal energy maintaining a manufactured public image, at times even inventing the fiction of a wife for the press early in his career. He never married and had no children. He did share his life with a long-term partner for roughly 2 decades, until that man's sudden death from a cerebral hemorrhage, and later he found companionship again with writer and producer Albert Williams, who remained at his side for the rest of his life. Sargent finally came out publicly on National Coming Out Day in the early 1990s, walking in a Los Angeles gay pride parade as an openly gay man for the first time. His former Bewitched co-star Elizabeth Montgomery showed up to support him, and the following year the two of them served together as grand marshals of the parade, a gesture of loyalty that meant a great deal to him. Sargent had already been diagnosed with prostate cancer by the time he came out, and he later said part of his motivation was refusing to let people assume, wrongly, that he was hiding an HIV diagnosis instead. He died of that cancer at age 64, just 1 year before Elizabeth Montgomery herself passed away. Losing both actors who had played Darren's on-screen wife's most devoted scene partner within such a short span still feels like a moment television never quite paused to properly grieve. Agnes Moorehead played Endora, Samantha's flamboyant, disapproving, endlessly theatrical witch mother, across the entire run of the series. She arrived on Bewitched already carrying 4 Academy Award nominations and a resume built alongside Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater, one of the most respected pedigrees in American acting. Privately, she reportedly referred to the sitcom dismissively as that witch show, and considered it beneath the level of work she had spent decades building. She took the job for financial security rather than creative passion, and yet on screen, she gave Endora everything she had, turning the character into one of television's most magnetic supporting performances. Moorehead married twice, and both marriages ended unhappily. Her first husband was an actor, and during that marriage the couple took in a foster son, though the relationship with him deteriorated so badly over the years that she eventually cut him out of her life entirely. Her second marriage, also to an actor, lasted only a handful of years. After that she kept her private life almost entirely out of public view for the rest of her career. Moorehead died of uterine cancer in the early 1970s, only a couple of years after Bewitched ended. Her death sits inside a genuinely strange and tragic footnote in Hollywood history. Years earlier, she had worked on a film shot near an active nuclear weapons testing site, a project that ultimately saw an unusually large share of its cast and crew, including major stars, diagnosed with cancer in the decades that followed. Whether that exposure caused her illness has never been proven, but it remains one of the more unsettling theories attached to her death. Endora was pure theatrical fireworks, but Agnes Moorehead herself was pure craft, and she never quite received the grand send-off her career had actually earned. Marion Lorne played Aunt Clara, the sweet and hopelessly scatterbrained witch whose spells rarely cooperated, and she remained on the show until her death partway through its run. Most viewers assumed they were watching a woman in her 60s. In reality, Lorne was already in her 80s when Bewitched premiered, performing physical comedy on national television every week, while audiences had no idea just how remarkable that feat actually was. In her personal life, Lorne had been married once, to a British playwright, and their partnership was a genuine creative collaboration that saw her appear in many of his stage productions across both London and New York. He died decades before she ever joined the cast of Bewitched, leaving her a widow for a very long stretch of her later life. The couple never had children. She poured such warmth into Aunt Clara that her real age became essentially invisible to the audience. Lorne died suddenly of a heart attack, and the production made the unusual choice to write Aunt Clara out of the story rather than recast the role, a quiet acknowledgement that some characters belonged to one performer alone. Then came one of the more heartbreaking footnotes in television award history. Lorne had been nominated for an Emmy for her work as Aunt Clara, and the award was announced only after her death. The ceremony went ahead. Her name was called as the winner, and she was already gone. Elizabeth Montgomery accepted the trophy on her behalf, and the whole moment stands as one of the industry's quieter tragedies, a well done delivered to someone no longer there to hear it. David White played Larry Tate, the pompous, credit-stealing, cheerfully oblivious advertising boss who anchored some of the show's sharpest comedy for all 8 seasons. White was already a seasoned character actor by the time the show began, a World War II Marine Corps veteran with a strong resume built on playing cads and smooth-talking hustlers. White married twice. His first wife was a respected stage actress, and together they had one son. Tragically, she died from complications during a second pregnancy when their son was still very young, and White raised the boy largely on his own before eventually marrying again and having a daughter with his second wife. White loved his son so deeply that he personally asked the Bewitched writers to name Larry Tate's on-screen baby after him, a small, tender tribute hidden inside a network sitcom plotline. Decades later, White's real-life son was killed in the terrorist bombing of a transatlantic flight that exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, one of the deadliest acts of aviation terrorism in modern history. He was in his early 30s. White spent the remaining years of his life as one of the quieter, more persistent voices advocating for the families of the victims of that bombing, a cause that clearly changed him in ways that never fully healed. He died of a heart attack less than 2 years after his son's death, and by many accounts those close to him believed grief played its own part in that decline. His ashes were placed at Hollywood Forever Cemetery alongside his sons, father and son together in the end after everything that had separated them in life. Erin Murphy took over the role of young Tabitha Stevens in the show's 3rd season, joining the cast as a toddler. What almost no one watching at home ever realized is that Erin shared the role with her fraternal twin sister for the first several seasons. The two of them carefully rotated in and out of scenes to stay within the strict legal limits placed on how many hours a small child could work. Viewers assumed they were watching one little girl grow up on screen. In truth, they were watching 2 toddlers, swapped with such precision that the trick went almost completely unnoticed for years, until the sisters grew old enough to look visibly different from one another, and only Erin continued in the part. As an adult, Erin Murphy has been married 3 times, and is the mother of 6 sons. Her sons range across those marriages, and one of them was diagnosed with autism, which turned Murphy into a genuinely committed advocate for autism awareness organizations. Rather than fading into obscurity the way so many former child stars do, she leaned fully into her connection to the show, building small businesses, appearing at fan conventions with real warmth, and speaking openly about how close she felt to her on-screen television parents growing up on set. In a story filled with addiction, illness, and loss among her castmates, Erin Murphy stands out as one of the clear, uncomplicated success stories, someone who genuinely made peace with where she came from and never stopped celebrating it. Alice Ghostly joined the cast partway through the show's run as Esmeralda, the nervous, unreliable witch whose spells had an unfortunate habit of making things, including herself, invisible. By the time she arrived on Bewitched, Ghostly was already a Tony Award-winning Broadway actress, a level of stage credibility that outranked most of her television co-stars before she ever filmed a single scene as Esmeralda. In her personal life, Ghostly had one marriage only, to an Italian-born actor she met early in her career. Their partnership lasted 50 years, ending only when he died of lung cancer, and the couple had no children together. By most accounts, theirs was a genuinely devoted, quietly private partnership built almost entirely away from Hollywood gossip. It was years later, in a very different supporting role on the ensemble comedy Designing Women, that Ghostly finally showed a much wider audience the full range of what she could do, earning an Emmy nomination for a performance that was sharp, layered, and genuinely funny in ways that required real craft rather than mere quirkiness. Ghostly died in her 80s after battling colon cancer and a series of strokes. The industry tended to file her permanently under the label character actress, But what she actually represented was a kind of irreplaceable comic talent that never quite got the marquee billing it deserved, whether the award shows acknowledged it or not. Casey Rogers stepped into the role of Louise Tate, Larry's cheerfully oblivious wife, partway through the show's run, taking over from an actress who had simply walked away to pursue a career in advertising. Rogers inherited the part, the wardrobe, and a black bouffant wig specifically designed to make her resemble the woman she was replacing, wearing it until the production eventually decided she had earned the right to appear as herself. Long before Bewitched, Rogers had a memorable brush with cinema history under a different professional name, playing the estranged wife, who gets strangled, in the opening act of a famous Alfred Hitchcock thriller. It was a striking screen credit, if not exactly the kind of role most actresses hope will define their early career. She married and divorced twice and raised 4 children, and after her television career wound down, she reinvented herself in a way almost nobody would expect from a former sitcom star. She became a genuine pioneer of women's motocross racing, founding an organization to support and promote female riders in a sport that had almost no place for women at the time. She also co-authored several books, including one built entirely around recipes inspired by Bewitched, turning her connection to Louise Tate into a small cottage industry built on genuine affection from fans. In her final years, she battled throat cancer with remarkable stubbornness, even flying across the country for a public tribute event to Elizabeth Montgomery while still undergoing treatment. She died in her early 80s, remembered by castmates and fans as one of the last surviving links to the show's earliest years. Alice Pierce played Gladys Kravitz, the shrieking, perpetually disbelieved neighbor whose only real crime was noticing exactly what was happening across the street. For the show's first 2 seasons, Pierce arrived on Bewitched as a Broadway veteran who had spent much of her childhood being shuttled through schools across Europe, wherever her father's banking career took the family. As a child, she fell off a swing and permanently altered the shape of her chin, and rather than hide from it, she built much of her comic persona directly around that distinctive face, joking openly about it for the rest of her career. She married twice. Her first husband was a composer, and after his death, she later married a Broadway stage manager and director. What almost none of her colleagues on set realized was that by the time she joined Bewitched, Pierce already knew she was dying. She had been diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer shortly before production began and was given only a matter of months to live. Yet she told almost no one involved with the show and continued performing exhausting physical comedy for 2 full seasons anyway. She died in her late 40s, and the network interrupted its regular evening programming to announce her death to viewers. Months later, she won an Emmy for the role, awarded posthumously, and her husband accepted the trophy on her behalf, having largely stepped back from his own career to care for her in her final stretch. He never remarried. Mabel Albertson played Phyllis Stevens, Darren's neurotic and endlessly interfering mother, across most of the show's run, famous for ending nearly every visit by insisting her husband take her home because she had a sick headache. By the time Bewitched began, Albertson had already worked for decades across vaudeville, radio, stage, and film, building a specific and highly reliable reputation for playing exactly this kind of domineering, anxious mother figure for a long list of major comedic stars. Her younger brother was Jack Albertson, an actor who went on to win a Tony, an Academy Award, and other major honors of his own, making the siblings one of the more accomplished pairs in mid-century American entertainment, both born to immigrant parents who had settled in Massachusetts. Mabel Albertson married twice.